I was born in August the 25th, 1917, and I was born in a house that was right on the corner of 4th Street and Van Buren.
He was the one that was born in the United States. His two older brothers, Joe and Frank, were born in Mexico. Their dad was born in Texas, and he was a mining engineer, and he would do business down in Mexico a lot. And my grandmother and my great-grandmother ran a boarding house down there. So I guess my grandfather would go and stay at the boarding house down there with them when he was on business in Mexico. So that's how he met my grandmother, and they eventually got married. And they had the two older boys down there. But anyway, my dad was born in the kitchen of a family by the name of the Grassos. And so he was the only one of the boys born in Arizona.
My brother Frank and I were real close together all the time. So one day he came to me and he said, you know, he says, it was around the last week in June. July the 4th was coming up. And he said, ask Mom if she'll give you a quarter so you can buy some firecrackers. I said, okay. So I went to Mom and I said, asked her if she'd give me a quarter. And she looked at me and she says, I'm not giving you any money to burn. So I says, okay, well then I'll go out and get a job. So she kind of laughed and said, yeah, well, go ahead. And of course there was no traffic to bother with it. So I went over to the butcher shop and went in the back door because they used to wholesale also, and a fellow by the name of Triblett. So I walked in there, and one of the butchers all knew me too. And Mr. Triblett came out, and a big guy, and he says, how can I help you? And I says, well, is there something that I can do to earn 25 cents to buy some firecrackers? And he said, saw it for a minute, and he said, yeah, I got something that you can do. So he picked me up and he set me on a stool so I could reach the counter. And he went back in his office, and he came out with a stack of order books. And the top was blank. And he had a rubber stamp and a pad. And he told me, he said, I want you to put the stamp on every page of these books. Okay, so I went there and I went through the books. I was 5 or 6 books. And Mr. Triblett came out and he went through some of the pages. So he complimented me on doing a good job. And so he took me and set me down on the floor again and reached in his pocket and he took out a quarter and he gave me a quarter for working. So that was my first job. When I was 10 years old, there was a drugstore at the corner of 4th Street and Van Buren. And the summer I was promoted from the 3rd to the 4th grade, I thought, well, I should get a job because my mom was earning a living by washing clothes. And so I went to the drugstore and asked them if they could use a young guy, and they said, and Mr. Burke was the owner, and so he said, yeah, we can hire you. St. Joe's Hospital at that time was a block north of there, St. Joe's Hospital. And hospitals in those days didn't have pharmacies. So anything that the patients needed or the doctors needed, you had to get from some drugstore, and they always got it from Dorsey Burke, or I'd say most of the time they did, and I delivered it. At one time in my life, I think I knew every doctor in town because I used to, a lot of times they would be in the emergency room and they needed some sutures or the needles or whatever. And I just walked into the emergency room uh, without even talking to anybody else, and hand it whatever the doctor needed to the doctor. When I worked at that drugstore from the 4th grade till I was a freshman in college. And in those days, you know, when a doctor wrote a prescription, he didn't have the luxury of writing a name of some product that some pharmaceutical house had put out. They actually wrote a formula, and the druggist would have to compound it. And so when I wasn't doing something else, well, I was in the pharmacy there, filling capsules or mixing the ointments for them or whatever it is. I did that all the time, and then I went to work for Sharp and Dome, who at that time was one of the largest pharmaceutical houses in the country. And I went there to work as a shipping clerk, and it was just the two of it, the boss and myself, the manager and myself. And when I wasn't doing anything, well, I went out, I'd go in the front office and help him with his work. So consequently, I learned all about the procedures of the company. My brother said, well, they're just getting ready to open Station 7 and 8. Why don't you take the exam and become a firefighter? So I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So I took the exam, and I was hired when they opened up Station 7 and 8. And that's how I ended up on the fire department. I never even gave it a thought that I wanted to be a firefighter. The engineer at Engine 5, which was at that time located on 7th Street between Palm Lane and Monte Vista, he used to sit and talk when we got through with our work and everything else, and he'd say to me, he says, you know, he says, if you decide to go in the service, whatever you do, don't go into the Army. He says, if you go in the Army, he says, beside your uniform, they'll give you a half a pup tent and a mess kit, and he said, you'll be sleeping on the ground, and he said, you'll be eating out of that mess kit. He says, and those darn sailors, he says, there's board ships sleeping between white sheets every night. So anyway, in September, I figured, well, the draft is going to get me anyway. And if I want to join the Navy, I better do it now. So I joined the Navy in September of '42. And with my background, having served in the drugstore for that many years, and then also the pharmaceutical house, and then a major in chemistry, they put me in the hospital corps. And I was working at the hospital there in Farragut, Idaho. Farragut don't even exist anymore, but it was about 30, 40 miles from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And I was there about 7 or 8 months, and I got some orders along with about 15 or 16 other guys to report to Port Hueneme, which is by Oxnard, California. And when we arrived there, the chief met us and said, let's put your Navy uniforms in your sea bag, because we're going to store them for you. And then they marched us over to the clothing room, and they issued us Marine khakis, a half a pup tent, and a mess kit. So I was in the amphibs, and I didn't sleep between white sheets for over a year. Well, I was discharged in towards the end of November of 1945, and I told my brothers, I said, well, I'm not going to go to work immediately. I'm going to take 30 days off, and I'll go back to work January 1. So I told the chief that too, and so, but my brother Joe was in the alarm room, so he told me, he says, you know, he says, they're looking for someone to work in the alarm room, and if you want the job, you'll get engineer's pay. So that sounded good to me. So I said, sure, I'll do that. So January 1, I went to work as a fire alarm operator.
I came along, and then my sister a year later. So they had the two girls, my sister and I. And I remember seeing movies. He has movies of us playing in the yard with the hose, and you know, it was fun to watch. And my sister and I used to put on these skits and dress up in these funny clothes. And there's movies of that. And we had, and it was fun. It was fun. I do remember those things of being little. We used to go on a vacation every year for a month. My dad would save up all of his vacation, so we would go for a month. And I mean, we went to some really great places. We got to see Yellowstone Park and Glacier National Park. We went all through California. We've been to Utah. So, it was a lot of fun. I remember we went through the redwoods, and they used to have this huge tree that you could drive through. And my dad pulled a trailer, so we, didn't stay in hotels and stuff like that. But that was half the fun, because we'd stay in these campgrounds, and it was a lot more fun, because you could just be out, and experience the forest and things like that. And I remember my dad was going to film us going through the tree, but he forgot to take because at that time they had these big mirrors that you could hook onto the mirrors on the car, and to see, on the side of the trailer. Well, he forgot to take those off. So my mom, we start driving through the tree. Well, we got stuck because the mirrors were too wide to go through the tree.
I first met Benny, and I think it was 1964 or 1965. I was 14 or 15 years old, and my father was a captain on B shift at Station 11, and Benny was the captain on A shift at Station 11. So I met him at Station 11 when I was a teenager, and then after I got hired on the fire department in 1968, I got to know him much better. Benny Ashley is probably the most unique person I've ever met. He is 100 years old. Mentally and physically, he is as sound as anybody I know, and he is so upbeat. I've known Benny since 1964, and I've never heard him say something negative about anybody. He certainly would never complain about himself. He's completely upbeat all the time. I knew his two brothers, Frank and Joe, and whenever there would be any kind of a union function and the three of them would be there, we would always want to get together because they were laughing and telling jokes and so positive. And Benny is still that way. He's just always upbeat, and what a role model for all of us. Each public safety entity, Phoenix Police, Phoenix Fire, Maricopa County Sheriffs, used to be the Highway Patrolman, now it's DPS. They all had their own separate pension system, and the benefits were different and the funding was different. And Benny was involved in creating the public safety retirement system, which brought all of the public safety units in the state of Arizona under one system. And that there had been an effort for a number of years to try to get that passed. And Benny was the union president in 1966 and 1967, and he didn't run for re-election, and he wanted to devote his full time to try to get the pension bill passed in the legislature, and so that's what he did. And in 1968, it was passed into law and signed by the governor, although the governor was not in favor of it, Jack Williams, but he did sign it, and so it became law.
It was New Year's Eve when we retired. And around 9 or 10 o'clock, I don't remember exactly, we had a call to the state hospital. And there was a fire there. I mean, there was a mattress in one of the rooms, and so we were there and mopping up, and at midnight, the back chief came along and tapped me on the shoulder and says, well, he says, hey, you're through. Come on, I'm going to take you back to the station. So he took me back to the station. So I actually worked up to the last minute of my tour duty.
My mother had breast cancer. She had breast cancer, and when she got breast cancer, back in those days, there really wasn't a whole lot to be done. You had radical surgery and you had radiation, and that was about it. But it just took over, and she passed away in 1974. She was only 57. So my dad was young, and I think it was about 3 years later, some friends suggested that they reintroduce my dad with Ruth, because my dad and Ruth had gone to grade school together at St. Mary's. So one evening, my dad and Ruth took us all to dinner. I believe it was her children too. She had 3 boys and a girl. We went to George's Olay, and we had Mexican food, and it was that night that they told us that they were getting married. It was a bit of a surprise, but I was really happy for my dad because he was only 60, and that's young. To live the rest of your life by yourself, if you don't have to. We were all happy for them. So they did get married, and they spent 24 years together also.
Prior to my retirement, I went and had a trailer built to my liking. It was a 21-foot travel trailer, and I did a lot of traveling. One time I pulled my trailer all the way to Mexico City. And at one time I put my trailer aboard a ferry there at Port Angeles and had took my trailer and car over to Victoria and traveled part of Canada over there. So I've been very busy, and of course there's always people wanting me to help them.
My dad has always been a private person, very private. And he doesn't like to be in the limelight, so to speak. He likes to be in the background, and right now he just doesn't get why we're making such a big fuss out of this 100th birthday. Because he said, I know that other people turn 100. And I said, I know, but I said, it's a big milestone. Not everybody gets to make it to 100 years in the condition that my dad is in. My dad is in really good health. He's not on any kind of medication for anything. He doesn't have any health issues that I know of, So he still does work on his cars. He still prepares his cooler for the summer. He gets up on the roof and, things like that. And I know my stepsister worries to death about that. She's always concerned that something's going to happen, and I've tried to tell her he knows his limits, and he does. And if he feels like he can do something, he's going to do it, you know. And I said, if something does happen, you know, then I feel like then it was his time to go, you know. He's been here for 100 years, and he's always done for himself, you know, and you can't tell somebody like that, no, you can't do this, you know. So I think he's very proud of that, you know. I think that's what keeps him going, you know, is that he has always done for himself. He's always taken care of himself, and he helps other people too. He's always been a big helper of people.
Just a month ago, my starter went out on me. So I changed the starter on my car. And of course, and the guy said, "Hey, don't do that. We'll do it for you." No, well, you know, it's something that you know, Tom Brokaw calls my generation the Great Generation, and it's amazing. You know, when I was a kid working for the drugstore, I handled cyanide. We used to have, cyanide was very common in those days. They used to use it for poisoning ants. We used to have oodles of red ants. And then I handled all kinds of acids and everything else. And one summer, since I always worked the night shift when I was working for the drugstore, I went to work for a steam fitter. And he bought asbestos powder in 55-gallon drums. And he'd say, "Hey, go out and mix me a batch of asbestos." And I'd go out there and mix it, pour water in the bucket and and the stuff was coming up, and I would, you know, just breathing all of it. And you know, I've never had any respiratory problems whatsoever. I've been all I can say is I'm a very fortunate individual. The good Lord has taken care of me, and must have had a couple of guardian angels to keep track and keep me out of trouble.